Welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, a forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of websites. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by Dario Castiglione, who has written one of the response essays for our October 2020 forum on Bernard Mandeville and F.A. Hayek. If you'd like to watch any of the other interviews by the authors for this forum, or any of the other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also on our YouTube channel. Dario Castiglione is a reader of political theory and its history at the University of Exeter. He has a particular emphasis on contemporary European issues. His main areas of expertise include democratic theory, the interconnection between state and society, the history of early modern political thought, and democracy and constitutionalism in the EU. He's currently one of the editors of the ECPR Press. He's been a research fellow at Australian National University, Canberra, University of Bremen, the Robert Schuman Center and European University Institute, Florence, Georgetown, and the New School University of New York. His most recent book is From Maastricht to Brexit: Democracy, Constitutionalism, and Citizenship in the EU, co-authored with Richard Bellamy, in which they discuss the current crisis in meaning and purpose of the EU, and it's available from Rowman and Littlefield. Dario, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and be invited in this interesting conversation on Mandeville and Hayek.
It has been, and I've said this to everyone I've spoken to so far, it's been very lively. And I think there's been a lot of mutual respect, but there's also been a fair amount of examining and back and forth. And it's been very lively and very, very interesting for me. And you and Mikko in particular have gotten into it a little bit over a couple of issues. And I wanted to start by asking you a question that I asked Andrea the other day when I spoke to him. And this is a question that I'm increasingly a little confused by. So I'm hoping you can illuminate me on this. So everyone seems to recognize that Mandeville has a distinction between what he calls self-love and self-liking. Can you help our viewers understand what that distinction is, and probably help me too, because the more I've thought about it and the more I've read about it, while I think they might be slightly different flavors of the same thing, I'm not sure they're all that distinct. So can you make a strong case that these are two distinct things that Mandeville should have separated?
Well, I think I read Mandeville a long time ago, and my main interest was at that time, I was doing my PhD on Hume at that time, was mainly on the way in which the satire worked around the thing. So I didn't really get deep into the discussion of the self-liking and self-love, but my impression is that he was trying to address the question that, in a way, a number of authors, and particularly Butler, was in some way criticizing him or other people who were seen as the people in some way defending mainly a very selfish kind of system, mainly based on egoism. And he was aware that there was something that had to be explained between the fact that although you can, in certain respect, reduce almost everything to a kind of selfish or self-centered way of acting, even altruistic motivation, after all, he gave many examples in his work, that altruistic motivation, at the end of the day, could be explained with a certain kind of satisfaction of the self. But in practice, there was a big difference between people who acted selfishly and egoistically and people who acted selfishly but altruistically. So I think he was, in some way, trying to deal with this issue. And in a sense, the introduction of the self-liking, particularly in the second volume, and then in the work on in his last productions, it's also something linked perhaps to his work as a physician of mental diseases, in which he was really trying to engage with a kind of self-understanding of the individual. And so what I think that he's trying to do in a certain way is to try to present self-love as a purely kind of self-centered and egoistic way of acting. But self-liking still something that is very much self-centered, but which in some way is to engage with others in different ways. And of course, the passion which was mainly behind this, which was also considered both a passion and a vice, was the idea of pride. So when he engaged in the second volume and trying to explain in that dialogue where he is playing the different parts, what this self-liking is in some way is moving away from a very simple position, which is entirely selfish and egoistical, to a position in which you can play different parts with other people. And you can, on one hand, in some way be vain, so pride and being proud as being vain. But on the other hand, as someone who wants to be well regarded by others. But in the moment in which you start to want to be well regarded by others, you're starting playing a double game. You're playing the game that you, in some way, you want others to like you, but also you want to be liked for what you are. And therefore, pride becomes a very much kind of ambiguous thing. So self-liking, in a way, I agree with you. The distinction between self-love and self-liking, in the way in which he presents it, it remains ambiguous because the self-liking itself can play different parts. And the pride or a number of other kind of passions of self-approbation, let's say, or self-liking or of emulation, it got different aspects. And he himself at one point says that self-liking can be either of a good type, in a sense where you really are, playing the part in which you are engaging with others in a real way in which you want to be liked by others, or in a way in which you are mainly a vain person. You may want to be liked by others, but you yourself know that you are not a likable person by others. So I think that is the problem, that he is actually moving towards a position which will then be occupied, I think, by people like Hume and Smith more clearly, where there are different aspects of this selfish kind of nature, or this self-centered nature, which in some way they can also be played in a much more moderate way. And for me, Mandeville, in many the satirist, instead is a kind of philosophy of excess. I mean, if you look at lots of his kind of representation of the society around him, it's a society where what work is excess. And what he criticized, the hypocritical way, is that always that you cannot limit excess. But this position of self-liking, it seems to me to move towards another position, which others, as I said, Hume and Smith in particular, will occupy later, but much more refined and a kind of self-conscious, moderate kind of way of playing the selfish passions.
When the impartial spectator begins to mediate, and you need that approbation of other people. It's interesting. I think that's I've come around to that point of view, that essentially when we think of Mandeville, because when I first read Smith, and I'd run into this guy Mandeville, and you'd see him, taken on, and you thought, well, so what is going on in here? And now that I've had a chance to read him and also read the essays in the forum, it seems to me that he's actually much closer to Smith's position, but his take on human nature is a little blunter, or a little bit less sympathetic than Smith's is. I think Smith's is a little more sophisticated. Let me push you a little bit on something, and then we'll move on to expand on this a little bit. It seems to me that Mandeville is probably, maybe not as much as Hume, but certainly more so than Smith, has a more well-developed sense of how politics works. Whereas Smith kind of leaves that out of Theory of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations. Hume probably has a little better sense of development of politics, but Mandeville's got a pretty good sense of it. How do we square the sort of rather egotistical view of human nature and the kind of view of excess and vice with a political system in England, even when Mandeville was there, of course, it wasn't full franchise or any of these things, but how do we square that with a living in a country that was fairly representative through a Europe that was becoming increasingly liberal? So is he just trying to get us to all recognize that vice exists in markets and exists in daily life, it exists in the passions that consume us, and it also exists in the political life? Or is that institutions really matter more so than individuals? How do we get that all together for Mandeville?
Well, of course, in many respects, he is also represented as a kind of the kind of Walpolean kind of philosopher, of the kind of the period of Walpole where corruption in some way was became a kind of important issues, and the kind of core politics where corruption is is part of the sinews of politics in a sense. Now, on one hand, because in his image also the skillful politicians, there is very much this way of dealing with the passions. In a way, the passions cannot be transformed, but they can be dealt with in a skillful way. Now, between here, I think from this point of view, you can move a next step and start thinking that institutions are in some way the things that you are yet to work out in order to precisely do this kind of operation of channeling the passions in the right direction. And I think, in the kind of general view of someone like Hume and Smith and others later, in some way the institutions acquires an important role, and that is their opposition to a kind of more classical type of republicanism where virtue should have been played a much more immediate role. Now, I wonder whether Mandeville has got I don't think that, although in a sense, particularly if one uses the ideas like unintended consequences, there are ways in which what the skillful politicians do is to elaborate ways and mechanisms and rules and institutions which then get solidified in a way in which you channel this passion. So you construct a society which is able to channel these passions. But I think that theoretically, he's too much, in some way, too much a satirist. In a way, the satire for me has always been an important element because it's always unsettling, even the things that he wants to establish. And while, of course, humans are able to, or the other people, in a way, who, want to scale in other context or other kind of figures, similar kind in the Enlightenment of this kind, in some way are trying to elaborate more solid discussion by institutions and how they control the passions and how they take the place of virtues. I think Mandeville is too much a satirist. In some way, he's enjoying himself too much very, very often in trying to debunk some of the kind of, so his figures are always very much, I think, it's, much more personalized. So I think he goes in that direction, or the way in which you move from this skillful intervention, almost a Machiavellian intervention on politics, to direct politics, to a more institutionally based. But I don't think you can find ideas that go in that direction, but not a real social theory, which instead is really then developing in other authors later on. But the vision of controlling the social passions, that's very much part of his discussion.
So it's interesting, you say in one of your essays, and I think this is very well said, there are no individuals without society, but there is no society without individuals. So, the causal arrows are pointing in both directions, right? These institutions need to be developed, but we are influencing them and they are influencing us, and the extent to which they can evolve and grow, it's a little difficult to say one way or another, what's causing what or who's causing what, but these two things do interact. And obviously thinking about it as a very atomistic world as Hobbes does, or even Rousseau in some ways, it's just not consistent with reality. So at least Mandeville does sort of recognize that people are interacting and these interactions have outcomes, and trying to apply some sort of external moral code that is perhaps unreasonable is just not something that those institutions are ever going to adapt to. I would ask you this about the satire, though. Do you think he could have had the kind of social impact or made the kind of social critiques that he did without the satire? I'm thinking about some of the stuff he wrote on public stews, obviously, but also some of the things that in the Grumbling Hive, where he's really pushing people to think, well, even without corruption, there's gains from corruption, and it's so provocative that it draws attention to the arguments. Doesn't that give him a little extra bite, or you think it undermines the intellectual capacity that he had?
No, no, I think first of all, of course, he made him a kind of a red author in his own time. I think there is a sentence in Dr. Johnson that, of course, all libertine had his book on his shelf, thinking that was a kind of a wicked kind of book, and just for the now actually there is I don't know whether you've seen it, but I wrote many years ago also a piece about the fortune of Mandeville throughout the kind of different periods, because of course he was very much read and discussed and translated up to, I think, the beginning of the 19th century, 1818 or something like that. And then for 100 years, there was no translation, no new edition. And so, I was actually once talking to my supervisor, Donald Winch, about this problem that he came, and that I wrote an article about that. And one of the things that I tried to argue in that piece, I reread it because I couldn't remember it anyway before this conversation. It's typical, no one forgets what one writes. But anyway, the one point that I was trying to make there is that, in a sense, some of the discussion that Mandeville was, or some of the satire and the paradoxes that he was putting forward at the beginning of the 18th century, by the end of the 18th century, they become almost common sense. They become moralized, at least they become part of the social kind of, or the kind of social analysis kind of language. Certain kind of ideas about utility, and this applies also to people like Hume, Smith, and others, of course. All these things, they become normalized. And therefore, the impact of these satires, of course, becomes less so, because in some ways, ideas have now become part of a common language. And then no such, but when he was writing, of course, I think he was really enjoying. I mean, the other thing that one has to remember, of course, he was, you mentioned the public stews. I translate into Italian the public stews, and I enjoy myself very much. I also try to translate in a more kind of using as much as I could a kind of 18th century Italian kind of vocabulary at that time. But then I discovered, that a number of long passages were actually more or less a paraphrase, if not plagiarism, of Montaigne. And I discovered, because also he just gave a quotation wrongly of an author of a passage anyway, that then it took me some time to get there. But then I discovered he was the kind of author. He was also using lots of different things, using lots of Bayle, lots of Montaigne, the skeptical authors. So there was an enjoyment probably in this kind of literary game. And therefore, in a sense, to go back to the point, in the ways, he was shocking. He wanted to shock people in a sense, but at the same time, many of his ideas, whether borrowed or not, in a way, they were really having an effect. Not because perhaps just because him, but because also the situation was evolving, language and discussion were evolving in a certain direction. So he was going with the current of the time, in a sense. So his paradox became less paradoxical as time was going, because actually it was both influential, this kind of discourses were influential, and they were going along with the time of a certain kind of social acquisition of understanding and the way of thinking, and also a general process of secularization in European societies, I think.
So it's interesting. Your response essay. This is a good transition to your response essay, in which you give 3 lessons for economists, and I think they're all important. But I want to sort of boil them down to one big conclusion, which is that these utility maximization models that we tend to use in microeconomics are just simply too blunt force, and they're not really rich enough for us to be able to gain a whole lot from them. And that's one of Mandeville's important lessons, is that even though he's a big believer in self-interest or I guess to use his language, self-love as a guiding force within markets, and that this kind of avarice or this materialism is ultimately a good thing for society, but that there are these other goals that people have. You cite Albert Hirschman, and then you cite 2 of my intellectual heroes, Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom. And you cited Lynn's work on the solutions to the tragedy of commons, a question that's been raised, well, I guess first by Hume, really, or well, maybe first by Aristotle, probably, but Hume, of course, illustrates it with draining the meadow, right, where you have to try to coordinate the 2 individuals and one of them is bound to defect if it's not in his or her own interest, and then later illustrated through the tragedy of commons through the work of Garrett Hardin. And she does it in a really, really interesting way by simply going out and examining the world. So Lynn Ostrom's basically a sociologist. And I want to ask you this, and also I should add, I think within her, even though she recognizes that there are oversimplifications in economics, that there's a heck of a lot of power in self-interest. The problem is coordinating to overcome these social problems. And the way she looks at it is sort of locally held institutions can help solve these collective problems, particularly if there's not a lot of top-down control. But they have to be self-governing, and they have to have enforcement mechanisms, and then you have to kind of create these. They have to be local, right? So, first of all, I guess my question is Mandeville a sociologist first and foremost? Do you think is he examining the world much as the Ostroms did, and reaching conclusions about it, rather than modern microeconomists who really aren't really interested in much in how the world works, but they're interested in modeling the way it should work using formal mathematical models? Or is he a moral theorist? Is he someone interested in institutional construction like the Ostroms? How is the simple message from Mandeville that we just have to move away from these oversimplifications of Homo economicus, or are there richer lessons here about observing people and how they interact, and how we can learn from those observations and then try to figure out how to make the world or understand it better in both those thinkers, Mandeville and the Ostroms?
Well, I'm not sure. I'll come to the Ostrom in a second, but in terms of what Mandeville was, I mean, you mentioned also sociologists. I think in your conversation also with Mikko, and he raised the issue about Mandeville being an anatomist. Now, as a matter of fact, as I said, when I got interested in Mandeville, mainly because I was actually working on a thesis on Hume. Mandeville was a side thing that it took me, it was a pleasurable kind of sidetrack kind of venture, which of course, is closely related to Hume. But the point that interested me very much, and that in some way started my also interest in Mandeville, was precisely that. When Hume, in some way, decides that he has to rewrite his philosophy into an essay form, and he writes, first the philosophical essay, and then actually starts writing kind of essays. He writes this essay about the difference between the kind of a moralist as a painter and the moralist as an anatomist. And actually, I think there is even all these images. He uses this image the first time, even in a letter to Hutchison. And this precisely trying to explain that in some way the kind of underlying skepticism, or the kind of underlying Mandevillian kind of element of his morals are precisely of the form of an anatomist. And of course, in a way, that's precisely what Mandeville is doing, because, if you can say, he's there a physician who is actually working on this issue, trying to interpret and dialogue with people who got melancholia or hysteria and so on and so forth. So he's trying to do this kind of work rather than being a painter of morality. So I think this is an important kind of image and metaphor. And in a sense, and for me, Hume, it's in many respects, also in some of his politics, in other ideas, for instance, in his discussion about against Locke, let's say, against the Lockean kind of contractual theory, when he develops a much more naturalistic theory of what is, in some way, the legitimacy of government that rests on opinion, I think he's actually developing what he could be almost a proto-sociological idea of political legitimacy. Now, in this respect, both Mandeville and Hume, and I think there is also a naturalist idea of obligation in Smith, they all in some way are of a kind of proto-sociological kind of authors. And in a way, they go quite in a different direction from the kind of much more normativist or ideas of political obligation or other aspect of justice that you find in authors, which are more in the contractualist line or eventually in the Kantian line and so on and so forth. So you can find this kind of thing. Although all this, of course, is before we got this category of sociological thinking and so on and so forth. But I think that is the right direction. But when we come to the Ostrom, what interests me, and I think that is precisely where Mandeville is not there, while instead, that's precisely where Hume, I think it's much more important, for instance, if you talk about that period, those kind of authors. It's what I think is the transformation of the transformation aspect of the relations between people. And you mentioned the fact that I conclude the first intervention on the individual and society. There are no individual without society, and there is no society with the individual. I think this is an important point because it's the more intersubjective point. It's also the issue about some of the game theory in the iterated games, and the introduction of iterated games in the game theory. You start introducing the fact that you can start playing those games which they seem to end up in social traps, in social dilemmas, and in kind of non-optimal social situation with the introduction of trust. How, there is an evolution in this game, an evolution of the game that actually produces trust. And I think that what the Lynn Ostrom in particular in that book, but also some other aspects of the work of her and her husband in some way points out is that in some way we cannot simply see this kind of this kind of paradoxes of rationality in collective action, which seem to end up in tragedies. But actually we have to see how the fact that we actually live in society and actually we solve this problem, and we solve in many different ways. And in a sense, what I think that their work and Lynn's work in particular in that book, and then through her book on institutions, but also more generally, perhaps some of the philosophical background that Vincent elaborates, perhaps even more than Lynn, in a way point to aspect of creativity and kind of deliberative engagement. So the engagement with others through self-reflective way. After all, one of the main points that comes also, particularly from the work of Vincent Ostrom, is the constitutional aspect, all the constitutional literature, the kind of two levels game that we play. We can play two-level games only if we are self-reflective kind of beings. And we are also capacity to elaborate rules, signs, and language. And I think that is the important point. And that some of the kind of rational choice, more traditional kind of approaches, forget this kind of deliberative way or this building up of trust. So what I think that what Mandeville does not have is the construction of trust, which instead you start finding in people like Hume and Smith in their kind of view of how society is developing from this kind of selfish passion, for instance. If you don't, so is for me, the intersubjective aspect, the fact that we are individuals which have got certain kind of passion, but these are continuously transformed and needs transformation and need in some way channeling through rules and institutions. And also, well, maybe I got a much more optimistic view, certainly Mandeville wouldn't have, that you can even produce habits. The other important element is that through institution, you can also produce second nature, forms of habits. So virtues, you don't need to have a kind of over-optimistic view of human nature in order to think that people can develop habits which are of a more sociable nature. I mean, there is another piece in which I try to distinguish between three different things in the debate about sociality. One is the pure sociality, the fact that you are in a social conditions. Now, people like Mandeville, when he talks about self-liking, that is, you have to you look for the approbation of other people, or in some way pride, after all, is something that you compare yourself to other people, emulation, all that. Clearly, you are maybe self-interest, but you are in a social situation. Even Hobbes, when he talks about glory, has got, fears is important, but glory is as important as fear in his state of nature. And glory can only be a comparative kind of thing. So there is a view of society which is inevitable once you go out of the, but then there is something else which is sociability. Now, the two things in the 17th, 18th century debate were very often collapsed. People who thought that human being was sociable, they were saying two things. They lived in society, but also they search for a real social contact. The two things are slightly different. You can have different theories. But I think that is another important point. And the third important point for me in this kind of more relation between individual and society is that individuals are always embedded in a social situation also in terms of identity and culture very often, at least in modern society, or even in older society. So there are three different ways in which individual and society interact. And you don't have necessarily to have an optimistic view of human nature or a pessimistic view to analyze these three different kind of operations.
And now we would have to go down the normative path, and unfortunately, our time is up. Dario, this has been a very, very engaging and rich conversation from a very, very interesting and provocative forum over one of the most fascinating thinkers that I've encountered in my years here at Liberty Fund, Bernard Mandeville. Thank you very much for participating in the forum, and thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview for the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters.
Thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed, and hope that our exchange has been amusing, if not useful.
I think it's been very useful. Thank you.
Thank you.